There is something deeply unsettling about the photograph even before you understand why, something that reaches you in a quiet, almost invisible way, as if your mind picks up details your eyes haven't processed yet, and you find yourself staring longer than expected at what appears to be a simple portrait. A mother seated stiffly in a wooden chair, her posture upright in the familiar way early studio photography demanded, her hands folded on her lap, her expression calm yet hollow, as though she had been rehearsing stoicism for years, and standing beside her, resting one small hand on her shoulder, is her young son, no more than 7 or 8, dressed neatly in what should be an ordinary shirt for the era. The studio backdrop is plain, unthreatening, with the soft blur that photographers of the early 1900s favored to eliminate distractions. Nothing about the lighting, the composition, or the antiquated formality looks unusual at first glance. And yet, the longer you look, the more an inexplicable tension begins to form, building quietly until it feels as though the image is holding its breath. It takes most viewers several seconds before they identify the detail that disrupts the entire photograph, but once they do, it becomes impossible to unsee the boy's shirt, or more precisely, the area of fabric over his chest, positioned directly beneath his small left hand. The shape traced into the linen isn't a stain, nor a tear, nor the blotched imperfections normally found in century-old photographs. It's something more defined, almost deliberate, something that resembles the faint outline of a handprint, yet no larger than his own, and positioned in a way that suggests pressure, as though someone had gripped the fabric tightly from underneath. When first examined, historians dismissed it as a flaw in the developing process. But as magnified scans circulated among archivists, pattern analysts, and restoration specialists, a different and far more troubling consensus began to form: the imprint did not behave like an artifact of age or damage. It retained shape consistency across multiple exposures of the same negative. The pressure points were aligned with a human grip. And most disturbingly of all, the handprint appeared on every version of the photograph, untouched, unwavering, regardless of restoration attempts, as though it had been there not just in the image, but in the moment it was taken. The origins of the photo only made things stranger. It was found inside a sealed envelope in the basement of a demolished house in Vermont, discovered during a government survey of abandoned rural properties. The envelope contained only the portrait and a scrap of torn newspaper dated 1904, with a fragment of text mentioning the Carter family and the boy's persistent condition. No further context. The archivist who first processed the batch noted that the mother's clothing matched styles from the early 1900s, specifically rural working-class attire rather than formal wear, which she should have been wearing for a studio portrait of this kind. But what pulled researchers deeper was not her dress, it was her expression. While the boy's face held the neutral, almost solemn compliance typical of children instructed to hold very still, the mother looked as though something weighed heavily on her just outside the frame. Her eyes seemed slightly off focus, not fixed on the camera lens but on something behind it or behind the photographer himself. Her mouth, though closed, appeared tense, corners subtly drawn downward, as though she had been holding back emotion rather than simply holding position. Archival experts who specialize in emotional reading of early photography have pointed out that mothers photographed with their children during this period usually displayed a faint softness in their gaze, a gentle pride or protective warmth. None of that is present here. Instead, her expression has the distant vacancy of someone expecting something to go wrong. As analysts studied the boy more closely, they noticed that his posture seemed unusually rigid even for an early 20th century portrait. His shoulders were drawn upward slightly. His stance was stiff, almost defensive. And his left hand, the one resting on his mother's shoulder, appeared not lightly placed but tense, with subtle pressure in the fingertips indicating he may have been gripping her more tightly than the camera captured at first glance. Archivists often say that early photographs, because of long exposure times, preserve not just faces but moments of truth, subtle tells, whispers of emotion, the body's quiet language. This image was full of whispers. When high-resolution scans were compared, researchers discovered that the boy's shirt fabric directly beneath his hand bulged outward at a faint angle, consistent with pressure applied from someone on his right side. But there was no one there. The space beside him was empty. The studio backdrop showed no shadow except the soft, faint one cast by his own small body. And yet the shirt seemed pulled, as though something unseen had a hold on it. Even more puzzling was the impossibility of what appeared to be the handprint itself. Forensic imaging revealed 5 distinct pressure shapes in the cloth, 5 finger-like curves, each matching the proportional spacing of a human hand, but not the boy's. The angles were wrong. The size was slightly narrower. The fingers appeared elongated. And the way the pressure curved upward suggested the hand was gripping from below, not above. To understand whether the effect could have come from the mother's hand pressing the boy's shirt from behind, researchers examined her arm angle. But her hands were visible in the photograph, both resting calmly on her lap. No possibility of deception. That's when attention turned toward the boy's shirt itself. Early shirts of that era were often hand-sewn, made from linen or cotton that wrinkled in distinct patterns. When experts studied the folds, they found an inconsistency. The fabric around the imprint had tension lines that pulled inward, not outward. This meant the pressure had come from beneath the cloth, beneath the surface of the shirt. But of course, that made no sense. Nothing could create an imprint from inside the shirt except the boy's own chest and shoulder. But the shape didn't match the anatomy of a child. And the idea that he could press his own hand beneath his shirt while also resting that same hand visibly on his mother's shoulder was impossible. The picture should have been dismissed as damaged, misleading, or misinterpreted. Yet no matter how it was tested, the imprint remained stubbornly physical, present, and real. The question then became, what happened to this family? And why was the portrait sealed and hidden? That's when an astonishing piece of information emerged. In the archives of a local Vermont historical society was a brittle, barely legible handwritten account from a doctor dated 1905 describing a child, unnamed, who complained of persistent pulling at the fabric of his shirt, especially at night, claiming, "Someone tugs at me." The note mentioned a worried mother, exhausted and frightened, who believed the boy was sleepwalking until she saw the marks on his chest herself. The account abruptly ended with the doctor stating he had recommended rest and a relocation to the mother's relatives, for the child's emotional well-being. No follow-up entries. No surnames. No confirmation that this note referred to the same family. But archivists could not ignore the eerie connection between the doctor's description and the handprint in the photograph. As interest grew, experts sought to authenticate the portrait through chemical analysis of the paper and ink. Results confirmed a timeframe matching the doctor's note, early 1900s, likely 1904, with materials consistent with a small rural photo studio. But then came the part that unsettled even hard-nosed archivists. When infrared imaging was applied to the photograph, researchers discovered faint, nearly invisible shadowing directly behind the boy's shoulder. Not a full figure. Not a person. But a blurred light distortion, like the echo of movement captured in the split second before the camera shutter closed. Something had been there. Something had moved. And whatever it was had interacted with the boy's clothing in the precise moment the photograph was taken. When this finding was shown to the team studying the portrait, one historian quietly remarked that the mother's distant, haunted expression suddenly made sense. Not because she saw the distortion, cameras of the time could capture motion beyond human perception, but because she may have sensed the presence. Mothers notice things before others do. And she looked, in that portrait, like a woman who already knew her son was not alone. What ultimately propelled the investigation further was not the photograph itself but the unexpected discovery of 2 additional items found in the same condemned Vermont house months after the portrait surfaced. Contractors clearing debris noticed a small wooden crate wedged behind a collapsed beam, its lid broken, its contents partially exposed. Inside were scattered papers, brittle and browned, along with a child's shirt carefully folded and placed in a separate cloth pouch. The shirt stopped researchers cold. It was unmistakably the same garment the boy wore in the portrait, same fabric weight, same stitching pattern, same hand-sewn buttons. But what stood out most was the fabric over the chest. It was wrinkled in a peculiar way, and even after more than a century, the linen bore faint depressions that aligned almost perfectly with the ghost-like imprint visible in the photograph. It was impossible for a fabric to retain such markings for so long unless pressed repeatedly and forcefully. And as restoration specialists handled the shirt, they noticed the fabric fibers were stressed inward, creating the same sunken pressure points as in the photograph. Whatever had pressed against the cloth had done so with a consistency that defied any natural explanation. More troubling was the interior side of the fabric. When the shirt was reversed, the area beneath the imprint showed faint discoloration, small circular patterns, almost like bruises transferred to the cloth. These weren't stains from age, they followed no typical pattern of moisture, mold, or dust. They followed the shape of fingertips. This finding drew the attention of researchers specializing in psychogenic folklore and early American supernatural reports. One historian, in particular, Dr. Eleanor Risto, had spent decades cataloging obscure family accounts from rural communities in New England. After examining the artifact, she connected it to an oral tradition from the early 20th century describing gripping spirits, entities that allegedly clung to a child in distress or followed families undergoing trauma. These stories, largely dismissed as superstition, mention sensations of tugging, pulling at clothing, and unexplained marks appearing on garments. Most were anecdotal, easily attributed to the anxieties of isolated communities. But what drew Dr. Risto deeper was a single detail she found in an old interview transcript with a Vermont midwife from 1906. The midwife described a boy who complained that someone hidden keeps holding onto my shirt, tugging at him so persistently he refused to sleep alone. The mother, the transcript noted, looked exhausted, frightened, and as though she dreaded the night. No names were recorded, but the location matched the region where the portrait was found. The timing matched. And the emotion conveyed, the quiet desperation of a mother watching her child grow pale and anxious, aligned eerily with the expression captured in the photograph. As the team pieced together the timeline, they made a critical observation. The portrait appeared to have been taken just months before the house was abandoned. Property records showed the home belonged to a widow named Margaret Ellery, who lived with her only son, Thomas, after losing her husband in a mill accident. The name Carter mentioned in the newspaper scrap was likely a misreading, old serif fonts and degraded ink often distorted letters. When the names were cross-referenced with census and church records, a near-perfect match emerged. A Margaret and a young boy, approximately the age of the child in the photograph, vanished from public documentation after 1905. No death certificates. No relocation records. No remarriage. They simply disappeared from the written history of the region. The house, left to decay, was eventually seized by the town decades later. In many early American communities, such disappearances weren't always recorded. Poverty, illness, and mass relocation often swallowed families without a trace. But the emotional gravity of the portrait suggested something more abrupt, more tragic. Interest in the case intensified when a large-format scan of the photograph was re-examined using modern photogrammetry. Researchers noticed a subtle shadow beneath the mother's chair, a darkened shape not caused by lighting or furniture. Its outline curved upward slightly, like an arm reaching around from behind. The shadow's curvature matched the position of the boy's shirt imprint. It was faint, so faint it could easily be dismissed, but when layered against the infrared scans that revealed the initial distortion behind the boy, a chilling pattern emerged. Something had been beside the child. Something had been reaching toward him. And the mother, seated so still, wearing that expression of exhausted dread, looked as though she could sense it too. The impossibility of the shadow only deepened the mystery. Early studio lighting was simple and directional. Shadows were sharp and predictable. No equipment in 1904 could create that shape unintentionally. And it did not align with the boy's body, the chair, or the backdrop. It aligned only with the imprint. That was when archivists revisited the crate found in the house. Beneath the shirt and papers was a notebook, water-damaged, barely legible. But one entry remained intact enough to transcribe. Written in a trembling hand, likely by Margaret, it read, "He wakes again crying that someone is holding him. Every night stronger. I sit beside him but cannot pull him free. It feels as though the air itself is alive. Another line followed, "The photograph man said he would capture our likeness. I pray he did not capture the thing as well." That final sentence stunned the research team. It indicated Margaret believed something present in their daily life, something invisible, something tormenting her child, had appeared in the photograph. And the more the team studied her expression, the more her fear seemed carved into every quiet detail of her face. She does not look like a woman posing for a cherished family portrait. She looks like a woman documenting evidence, freezing in time the one thing she cannot otherwise prove. But the most haunting discovery was yet to come. In the notebook's final pages, nearly unreadable from water damage, were fragmented lines describing an event: pulling, gasping, he said it wouldn't let go, tried to lift him, fabric tearing, no breath. The lines were shaky, desperate, and abruptly ended. A forensic linguist studying the strokes noted the writing pressure increased significantly in these entries, consistent with someone writing in panic. There was no follow-up, no explanation, no final entry. It was the last thing Margaret ever wrote. Combined with the disappearance of both mother and son from all records, the implication was grim. Something happened, something sudden, catastrophic, and terrifying enough that whatever remained afterward left the house to rot. But the photograph, sealed in an envelope and hidden away, suggests Margaret wanted someone to find it someday. She wanted someone to understand. When archivists compared the portrait's shirt imprint with the physical shirt, they made one last observation: the markings on the real fabric were deeper, more stressed, more violently shaped than in the photograph. This meant one of two things: either the photograph had been taken before the phenomenon grew more forceful, or the imprint in the portrait was only the beginning. The shirt preserved a moment the camera could not fully capture. And when the crate was discovered, that same shirt lay folded carefully, as though placed there by someone who knew its significance. But there was no evidence Margaret ever left the house. And if she had, she would not have left the shirt behind. It was the proof she feared no one would believe. To this day, no explanation fully satisfies the researchers who worked on the case. The photograph stands as one of the most disturbing artifacts in the archive. Not because of what is seen, but because of what is only barely, faintly, terrifyingly captured, the final traces of something that seemed to cling to a child with increasing strength, something his mother fought against but could never escape, something that left its mark not only on the fabric, but on the moment itself. And perhaps the most unsettling detail of all is what analysts noticed during a final review: in the faintest corner of the photograph, barely visible until enhanced, a second impression appears, not on the boy's shirt but on the mother's sleeve, as though something had begun reaching for her too.